Welcome to Story Time with the UC Riverside Libraries, presented to you by the Finals Week Stress Relief Team. We're bringing you a series of exciting stories originally curated by the brothers Grimm. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected and published folklore in the 19th century, and much of their work remains popular to this day with film and television adaptations, along with being published in over 100 languages. Today's tale is one of the most famous and infamously wicked coming-of-age stories. So sit back, relax, listen, and read along if you like, to Hansel and Gretel.
Tales from Grimm. Freely translated and illustrated by Wanda Gag. Hansel and Gretel. In a little hut near the edge of a deep forest lived a poor woodchopper with his wife and his two children, Hansel and Gretel. Times were hard. Work was scarce and the price of food was high. Many people were starving, and our poor woodchopper and his little brood fared as badly as all the rest. One evening, after they had gone to bed, the man said to his wife, "I don't know what will become of us. All the potatoes are gone, every head of cabbage is eaten, and there's only enough rye meal left for a few loaves of bread." "You are right," said his wife, who was not the children's real mother, "and there's nothing for us to do but to take Hansel and Gretel into the woods and let them shift for themselves." She was a hard-hearted woman, and did not much care what became of the children. But the father loved them dearly, and said, "Wife, what are you saying? I would never have the heart to do such a thing." "Oh, well then," snapped the stepmother, "if you won't listen to reason, we'll all have to starve." And she nagged and scolded until the poor man, not knowing what else to say, consented to do it. "May heaven keep them from harm," he sighed. Hunger had kept the children awake that night, and lying in their trundle beds on the other side of the room, they had heard every word their parents had said. Gretel began to cry softly, but her brother Hansel whispered, "Don't worry, little sister, I'll take care of you." He waited until the father and mother were sleeping soundly. Then he put on his little jacket, unbarred the back door, and slipped out. The moon was shining brightly, and the white pebbles which lay in front of the house glistened like silver coins. Hansel bent down and gathered as many of the shiny pebbles as his pockets would hold. Then he tiptoed back to the bed and told Gretel he had thought of a very good plan for the morrow. At break of day, the mother came to wake the children. "Get up, you lazy things," she said. "We're off to the forest to gather wood. Here's a piece of bread for each of you. Don't eat it till noon. It's all you'll get today." Gretel carried both pieces of bread in her apron, because of course Hansel's pockets were so full of pebbles. They were soon on their way to the forest, the mother first with a jug of water, the father next with an axe over his shoulder, Gretel with the bread, and Hansel bringing up the rear, his pockets bulging with pebbles. But Hansel walked very slowly. Often he would stand still and look back at the house. Come, Hansel," said the father. "Why do you lag behind?" "I'm looking at my little white kitten, Papa. She's sitting on the roof and wants to say goodbye." "Fool," said the mother. "That's not your kitten. That's only the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel lingered on and dropped the pebbles behind him, one at a time, all along the way. It was a long walk, and Hansel and Gretel became very tired. At last the mother called a halt and said, "Sit down, children, and rest yourselves while we go off to gather some wood. If you feel sleepy, you can take a little nap." Hansel and Gretel sat down and munched their bread. They thought their father and mother were nearby, because they seemed to hear the sound of an axe. But what they heard was not an axe at all, only a dry branch which was bumping against a dead tree in the wind. By and by, the two little children became so drowsy, they lay down on the moss and dropped off to sleep. When they awoke, it was night, and they were all alone. "Oh, Hansel, it's so dark. Now we'll never find our way home," said Gretel, and began to cry. But Hansel said, "Don't cry, little sister. Just wait until the moon is out. I'll find the way home." The moon did come out, full and round and bright, and it shone on the white pebbles which Hansel had strewn along the way. With the glistening pebbles to guide them, they found their way back easily enough. Dawn was stealing over the mountain when they reached their home, and with happy faces they burst in at the door. When their mother saw them standing before her, she was taken aback. But then she said, "Why, you naughty little children, where have you been so long? I began to think you didn't want to come back home." She wasn't much pleased, but the father welcomed them joyfully. He had lain awake all night worrying over them. Luckily, things now took a turn for the better, and for several weeks the woodchopper was able to earn enough money to keep his family from starving. But it did not last. And one evening, the children, still awake in their trundle beds, heard the mother say to the father, "I suppose you know there's only one loaf of bread left in the house, and after that's eaten, there's an end to the song. We must try once more to get rid of the children, and this time we'll take them still deeper into the woods, so our sly Hansel can't find his way back." As before, the father tried to talk her out of it, but the hard-hearted stepmother wouldn't listen to him. He who says A must also say B, and because the father had given in the first time, he had to give in this time as well. Hansel saw that he would have to get up and gather pebbles again, and as soon as his parents were asleep, he crept out of bed. But alas, the door was locked now, and he had to go back to bed and think of a different plan. The next day, everything happened as it had the first time. Hansel and Gretel were each given a crust of bread, and then they all went forth into the forest. Hansel brought up the rear as before, and kept straggling behind the rest. "Come, come, Hansel," said the father, "why do you lag behind?" "I see my pet dove, Papa. It is sitting on the roof and wants to say goodbye to me." "Fool," said the mother, "that's not your dove. That's only the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel kept on loitering because he was, again, busy making a trail to guide them back home. And what do you think he did this time? He had broken his bread crust into tiny pieces, and now he was carefully scattering the crumbs one by one behind him on the path. They had to walk even farther than before, and again the parents went to gather wood, leaving Hansel and Gretel behind. At noon, Gretel shared her bread with Hansel, and they both fell asleep. When they awoke, it was dark, and they were all alone. This time, Gretel did not cry because she knew Hansel had scattered crumbs to show them the way back. When the moon rose, Hansel took her hand and said, "Come, little sister, now it's time to go home." But alas, when they looked for the crumbs, they found none. Little twittering birds, which fly about in the woods and glades, had eaten them all up. Two unhappy children walked all that night, and the next day too, but the more they looked for the way, the more they lost it. They found nothing to eat but a few sour berries, and at last, weak and hungry, they sank down on a cushion of moss and fell asleep. It was now the third morning since they had left their home. They started to walk again, but they only got deeper and deeper into the wood. They felt small and strange in the large, silent forest. The trees were so tall and the shade so dense. Flowers could not grow in that dim, gloomy place, not even ferns. Only pale, waxy mushrooms glowed faintly among the shadows, and weird lichens clung to the tree trunks. Suddenly, into the vast green silence fell a ripple of sound so sweet, so gay, so silvery, that the children looked up in breathless wonder. A little white bird sat there in a tree, and when its beautiful song was ended, it spread its wings and fluttered away with anxious little chirps, as though it wished to say, "Follow me, follow me." Hansel and Gretel followed gladly enough, and all at once they found themselves in a fairy, flowery clearing, at the edge of which stood a tiny cottage. The children stood hand in hand and gazed at it in wonder. "It's the loveliest house I ever saw," gasped Gretel, "and it looks good enough to eat." They hurried on, and as they reached the little house, Hansel touched it and cried, "Gretel, it is good enough to eat." And if you can believe it, that's just what it was. Its walls were made of gingerbread, its roof was made of cake, it was trimmed with cookies and candy, and its window panes were of pure, transparent sugar. Nothing could have suited the children better, and they began eating right away. They were so hungry. Hansel plucked a cookie from the roof and took a big bite out of it. Gretel munched big slabs of sugar cane which she had broken from the window. Suddenly, a honeyed voice came floating from the house. It said, "Nibble, nibble, nottage, who's nibbling at my cottage?" To which the children said mischievously, "It's only a breeze blowing down from the trees." At this, the door burst open, and out slithered a bent old woman, waggling her head and leaning on a knotted stick. Hansel stopped munching his cookie, and Gretel stopped crunching her sugar cane. They were frightened, and no wonder. The old one was far from beautiful. Her sharp nose bent down to meet her bristly chin. Her face, all folds and wrinkles, looked like an old shriveled pear, and she only had 3 teeth, 2 above and 1 below, all very long and yellow. When the old one saw that the children were turning to run away, she said in sugary tones, my little darlings, what has brought you here? Come right in and stay with me. I'll take good care of you." She led them inside, and there in the middle of the room was a table neatly spread with toothsome dainties, milk, pancakes and honey, nuts, apples, and pears. While the children were eating their fill, the old one made up 2 little beds which stood at one end of the room. She fluffed up the feather bed and puffed up the pillows. She turned back the lily-white linen, and then she said, "There, my little rabbits, a downy nest for the each of you. Tumble in and slumber sweetly." As soon as Hansel and Gretel were sound asleep, the old one walked over and looked at them. She said, "They're mine for certain." Now, why would she do that? Well, I must tell you the real truth about the old one. She wasn't as good and friendly as she pretended to be. She was a bad, bad witch who had built that sweet and sugary house on purpose to attract little children. Witches have ruby red eyes and can hardly see at all, but oh, how they can smell with those long, sharp noses of theirs. What they can smell as human beings, and that morning, as Hansel and Gretel were wandering around in the forest, the old one knew it well enough. Sniff, sniff, sniff went her nose. She had been sniffing and waiting for them all day. The next morning, while the 2 little innocents were still sleeping peacefully, the old one looked greedily at their round arms and rosy cheeks. She mumbled, "Juicy morsels." She yanked Hansel out of bed, dragged him into the backyard, and locked him up in the goose coop. Hansel screamed and cried, but it did him no good. Then the old one went into the house, gave Gretel a rough shake, and cried, "Up with you, you lazy bones. Make haste and cook some food for your brother. He's out in the goose coop, and if we feed him well, what a tasty boy he'll make." When Gretel heard this, she burst into tears, but the old one gave her a cuff on the ears and said, "Stop howling, you fool. Pick up your legs and do as I tell you." Each day Gretel had to cook big pots full of fattening food for Hansel, and each morning the old one hobbled out to the goose coop and cried, "Hansel, let me see your finger so I can tell how fat you're getting." But Hansel never showed her his finger. He always poked out a dry old bone, and the old one, because of her red eyes, never knew the difference. She thought it really was his finger, and wondered why it was that he did not get fat. When 4 weeks had passed, and Hansel seemed to stay thin, the old one became impatient and said to Gretel, "Hey there, girl, heat up a big kettle of water. I'm tired of waiting, and be he fat or lean, I'm going to have Hansel for my supper tonight." Gretel cried and pleaded with her, but the old one said, "All that howling won't do you a bit or a whit of good. You might as well spare your breath." She built a roaring fire in the stove and said to Gretel, "First we'll do some baking. I've mixed and kneaded the dough, and the loaves are all ready for the oven." Then she opened the oven door and added in a sweet voice, "Do you think it's hot enough for the bread, Gretel dear? Just stick your head in the oven and see. There's a good girl." Gretel was about to obey when a bird, the same white bird which had led them out of the forest, began to sing a song. It seemed to Gretel he was singing, "Beware, beware, don't look in there." So Gretel didn't look in the oven. Instead she said to the old one, "Well, I really don't know how to go about it. Couldn't you first show me how?" "Stupid," cried the old one. "It's easy enough. Just stick your head way in and give a good look around. See, like this." As the old one poked her horrid old head into the oven, Gretel gave her a push and a shove, closed the oven door, bolted it swiftly, and ran away. The old one called and cried and frizzled and fried, but no one heard. That was the end of her, and who cares? Gretel was already in the backyard. "Hansel," she cried, "we are free. She opened the door of the goose coop and out popped Hansel. The children threw their arms around each other and hopped and skipped around wildly. But now there came a soft whir in the air. The children stopped dancing and looked up. The good white bird and many others, all the twittering birds from the fields and glades, were flying through the air and settling on the cake roof of the gingerbread house. On the roof was a nest full of pearls and sparkling gems. Each little forest bird took out a pearl or a gem and carried it down to the children. Hansel held out his hands, and Gretel held up her apron to catch all these treasures, while the little white bird sat on the roof and sang, "Thank you for the crumbs of bread. Here are gems for you instead." Now Hansel and Gretel understood that these were the very same birds who had eaten up their crumbs in the forest, and this was how they wished to show their thanks. As the birds fluttered away, Hansel said, "And now, little sister, we must make haste and get out of this what you would. As for me, I got very homesick sitting in the goose coop week after week." "And I," said Gretel, "yes, I've been homesick too. But Hansel, here we are so far from home, and how can we ever find our way back?" Ho, what luck! There was the little white bird fluttering ahead of them once more. It led them away, and soon they were in a green meadow. In front of them lay a big, big pond. How to get over it? As Hansel and Gretel stood on the shore wondering what to do, a large swan came floating by, and the children said, "Float, swan, float, be our little boat." The swan dipped its graceful head, raised it, and dipped it again. That meant yes. When the swan had taken the children one by one to the other shore, they thanked it prettily and patted its long curved neck. Near the water's edge ran a neat little path. Hansel and Gretel followed it, and now the trees and the fields began to look familiar. Soon they saw their father's house gleaming through the trees, and they ran home as fast as they could. The father, who had been grieving and looking for his lost children all this time, was sitting in the front of the hearth, gazing sadly into the fire. As the door burst open and his two little ones ran in with shouts and laughter, his eyes filled with tears of joy. He hugged them and kissed them, and all he could say was, "My treasures, my little treasures." "Oh, as to treasures, Papa," said Hansel, putting his hands into his pockets, "we'll show you some. See now, we will never have to starve again." At this, Gretel poured a shower of jewels from her apron, while Hansel added handful after handful from his pockets. And the hard-hearted stepmother, where was she? Well, I'll tell you. When Hansel and Gretel seemed to be gone for good, the woman saw that her husband could think of nothing but his lost children. This made her so angry that she packed up her things in a large red handkerchief and ran away. She never came back, and Hansel and Gretel and their good father lived happily ever after. The end.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's Brothers Grimm installment. I know I did. You can find many more titles like this by visiting the UC Riverside Library catalog at library.ucr.edu. See you next time.